All right, let's talk about the time evolution basically hit the turbo button. We're going way, way back to a period when life on this planet went from, well, pretty simple to completely spectacularly weird in what was basically the blink of a geological eye. This is the story of the Cambrian explosion. So here's the big mystery we're going to try and crack today. For billions of years, billions with a B, life was, kind of boring. We're talking single-celled organisms, maybe some slimy microbial mats. That's it. And then all of a sudden, it's like a cosmic party started. The oceans were suddenly teeming with this menagerie of bizarre, complex, incredible creatures. So the question is, what lit the fuse? We're going to treat this like a 500-million-year-old cold case, and we're going to hunt for the clues.
Okay, first things first, let's just get our bearings. We're talking about the Cambrian period. Fun fact, the name actually comes from Cambria, which is the old Latin name for Wales. That's where rocks from this time were first studied. But nobody remembers it for that. Its fame is all about one thing, the Cambrian explosion. Now, this wasn't a literal boom, of course. It was an evolutionary explosion, a biological Big Bang, where almost all the major blueprints for animal life, the different body plans we still see today, just burst onto the scene in the fossil record.
And to really get how wild this was, you have to look at the timeline of, well, everything. So Earth forms about 4.6 billion years ago. The very first, simplest life shows up maybe a billion years later. And then, not a whole lot happens. Seriously, for 3 billion years, life just kind of hangs out, being microscopic. And then, bam, the Cambrian explosion. In the grand, epic story of life on Earth, this whole incredible event was just a brief chapter. But it's the chapter that set the stage for literally everything that followed. Dinosaurs, mammals, you, me, it all starts here. So our investigation begins where any good investigation does, at the scene of the crime. In this case, that's the entire planet. What was going on with Earth itself? What was in the air or, well, in the water, that could have possibly set the stage for something so dramatic? Turns out, our planet was getting a major makeover. So check out this incredible chain reaction. It all starts with this massive geological event that some scientists call the Great Unconformity. Just picture this. Over hundreds of millions of years, glaciers and water scrape away billions of years worth of rock right off the continents. This uncovered enormous amounts of fresh new rock. And what happens to that rock? It erodes. It washes into the oceans, basically dumping a planet-sized bag of chemical fertilizer into the water. The seas were suddenly flooded with things like calcium and phosphate, which, hey, just happen to be the exact building blocks you need to make shells and skeletons. And this leads to a really fascinating kind of mind-bending idea. We usually think of shells as armor, right? An animal evolves a hard shell to protect itself from getting eaten. But what if that's not the whole story? This new evidence suggests that the oceans became so full of these minerals, so saturated, that it was actually toxic for the organisms living there. They had to get these excess ions out of their systems somehow. So what did they do? They started packaging them up and sticking them on the outside of their bodies. Armor wasn't the goal. It was an accidental byproduct of detoxification. It was a life-saving solution that would, pretty soon, become very, very useful. Now, for a long, long time, the story of oxygen was pretty simple. Oxygen levels went up, and that allowed a bigger, more complex life to exist. It makes sense, right? If you want to be an active predator, you need a lot of fuel, a lot of oxygen. But the real story, as we're now discovering, is way more dramatic. The Cambrian oceans weren't some stable, oxygen-rich paradise. They were on a chemical roller coaster. Oxygen levels would spike, and then they'd crash, sometimes plunging so low that the water was basically unbreathable. This wasn't a gentle nursery for new life, it was a brutal boot camp. This intense, constant stress forced life to get creative, to innovate, to evolve incredibly efficient ways to breathe and move blood around just to survive the lean times. Okay, so we've got our crime scene. The planet is primed chemically and geologically for revolution. But, just having a pile of gunpowder doesn't give you an explosion. You need a spark, you need an ignition source. Our second clue isn't in the rocks or the water, but inside life itself. It's the evolution of a brand new genetic toolkit. I want you to imagine trying to build a really complex piece of IKEA furniture, but with no instructions. That's basically what life was doing for 3 billion years. And then it got the instruction manual. A whole new set of genes evolved, like the Hox genes. These were like the master architects, the genes that said, okay, the head goes here, the tail goes over there, and let's put some limbs in the middle. At the same time, other new genes, like parahox genes, allowed for one of the greatest inventions ever, the through gut, a digestive tube with a mouth at one end and an exit at the other. This was a total game changer. It meant animals could eat and process food constantly, which created a massive energy surplus. Life finally had the blueprints and the power supply to build bigger, better, and way more complicated bodies. Okay, clue 1, the planet provided the raw materials. Clue 2, genetics provided the blueprints. Now for our third and final clue, which is all about opportunity. Because when you unleash all these new, souped-up animals into the world, what happens? They start interacting. And that interaction sparked a feedback loop of competition that fanned the flames of evolution into an absolute inferno. Before the Cambrian, the seafloor was, well, it was like a perfectly made bed. It was covered in this thick, stable, almost rubbery mat of microbes. Life pretty much happened on top of the mat. But then, armed with muscles and body plans, animals started to do something new. They started to burrow. They started digging down into the sediment, looking for food or making a safe place to hide. And this changed everything. They churned up the seafloor, turning this stable, two-dimensional mat ground into a soupy, messy, three-dimensional mixed ground. Now, this totally wrecked the old ecosystem, but it opened up a whole new world of possibilities, creating tons of new places to live down in the mud. And then, someone flipped on the lights. This is the brilliant light switch theory. The idea is that the single biggest trigger for the explosion was the evolution of the very first true, complex image-forming eyes. I mean, think about it. For the first time ever, animals could really see each other. Predators could lock onto a target. Prey could see danger coming and react. The world went from a blurry, slow-motion game of Marco Polo to a high-definition, life-or-death chase scene. This kicked off a frantic evolutionary arms race. You get a better eye, I get a harder shell. You get faster, I get better camouflage. And this cycle just drove diversification through the roof. And if you need a poster child for this scary new world, look no further than this guy, Anomalocaris. For a long time, this was the undisputed king of the Cambrian jungle. I mean, it was 2 feet long, which was gigantic for the time. It had these fearsome-looking spiky arms up front and a weird circular mouth. The classic picture we had was of this thing swimming around, snatching up hard-shelled trilobites and just crushing them to bits. A true monster of the deep. But, science is all about questioning what we think we know. Even our most famous monsters have to stand up to new evidence. So what if that classic image of the shell-crushing terror was wrong? What if Anomalocaris was a completely different kind of predator? Well, recent studies have painted a brand new portrait of this iconic creature. Scientists actually modeled its front appendages and found something amazing. They were probably too weak. They would have broken if they tried to crush a hard trilobite shell. So the new thinking is that Anomalocaris was a high-speed pursuit predator. It wasn't a bruiser, it was a speedster, chasing down soft-bodied prey in the open water. And get this, its compound eyes had over 16,000 lenses each. That's vision on par with a modern dragonfly, one of the best hunters alive today. This wasn't a brute, it was a sleek, high-tech predator built for the new world of sight. So, we've looked at the scene of the crime, we've figured out the motive, and we've established the opportunity. We've gathered all our clues, it's time to bring it all together and finally deliver the verdict on what caused the Cambrian explosion. And the verdict is, there was no single culprit. There's no one smoking gun. The Cambrian explosion happened because of a perfect storm. It was this incredibly rare and spectacular moment in our planet's history when all the right ingredients came together at exactly the right time. You had the planet's changing chemistry providing the raw materials for bodies and shells. You had life's evolving genetic code providing the blueprints to build those bodies. And you had brand new ecological pressures like seeing and being seen, providing the motivation, the opportunity to use those new tools. It was the combination of all three that just unleashed life's creative potential. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's a cool story, but it happened 500 million years ago. Why does it matter to me? Well, it matters because the legacy of that ancient explosion is all around us. In fact, it's inside of us. We are, all of us, living with the consequences of that perfect storm every single day. Just think about your own body for a second. The basic blueprint, a head up top, a torso in the middle, 2 sides that are basically mirror images of each other, that whole design was first drafted back in the Cambrian. Our oldest, most distant vertebrate ancestor, a little fish-like guy called Hycoichthys, was actually swimming around in those oceans. The very eyes you're using to see this right now, their story starts with that light switch moment. And the planet still holds the memories. Rocks in places like Japan's Hitagayen Belt, for example, have fossils of trilobites that tell us that that piece of land was once part of the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana, bordering one of these Cambrian seas. Now, because this past is so ancient and weird, it can sometimes lead to some pretty wild stories. You may have seen this picture online. People claim it's a 300-million-year-old precision screw found inside a rock, and they say it's proof of ancient aliens or lost technology. But the reality is, I think, even cooler. That's not a screw. It's the fossilized stem of an animal called a crinoid, or a sea lily. It's related to starfish, and its stem was made of these little stacked discs that, when they fossilize, just happen to look exactly like screw threads. It's a perfect case of what we call pareidolia. It's just our brains trying to see a familiar pattern, a face or a tool, in a random shape. And all of this brings us to this one really powerful idea. The body plans that define almost every animal on Earth, the predator-prey dynamics that drive ecosystems, the very act of seeing the world, so much of what it means to be an animal today was forged in that brief, fiery, creative period. We truly are, all of us, living in the echoes of the Cambrian explosion. The events of the Cambrian didn't just create new animals. They completely redefined the rules of life on this planet, setting the course for the next 500 million years. And that leaves us with one final, pretty heavy question to think about. In our own time, right now, we are changing the planet on a scale and at a speed not seen since some of those ancient geological events. So what will our echo be? What legacy will this era leave behind in the deep, deep future? All right, Cambrian fanatics, this one's for you. Welcome to the Cambrian Master Challenge. You think you know your stuff when it comes to this wild, explosive period in Earth's history? Well, we're about to put that to the test. Let's see what you've got. So here it is. This is a formal challenge. I'm inviting you to step into a time machine with me, to go back more than 500 million years. We're going to face a gauntlet of questions, diving deep into the ancient seas and onto the first shores of a world that was just bursting with new life. So here's how this is going to work. Our challenge is split into 5 rounds. We'll cover everything from the geology that set the stage all the way to the final curtain call of this incredible era. Ready? Let's kick things off with round 1. The stage is set. Okay, question 1. Let's get right into it. Now, we used to think the start of the Cambrian was all about trilobites showing up, but now we know the official line in the sand is something way more subtle. So, what's the name of this trace fossil, and what was the creature that made it doing that was so revolutionary? And the answer is Trichoficus pedum. And you have to understand, this was a total game changer. Before this, life was basically crawling around on the surface of the seafloor. It was a 2D world. This little fossil shows us the first time an animal got the idea to burrow down, to move in 3 dimensions. This one behavior would completely re-engineer the entire ocean floor. Question number 2. We're moving from the fossils to the rocks themselves. Deep below the Cambrian layers, there's this massive gap in the geological record. We call it the Great Unconformity. So, how did the very process that created this gap actually give animals the building blocks they needed to create armor? Okay, check this out. It's a wild story. First, you get this massive erosion of continents, washing a flood of minerals, especially calcium, into the oceans. The seawater got so soupy with this stuff that animals had to actively pump it out of their bodies just to survive. But, evolution is clever. It took that process, basically a detox system, and co-opted it to create something amazing, the very first shells. So just think about that. The armor that defined an entire era might have started as a way to take out the trash. All right, on to round 2. We actually hinted at this with our very first question. That vertical burrowing kicked off what we call the Cambrian substrate revolution. So what was it exactly? Tell me what the seafloor looked like before and after. The difference here is like night and day. Before, in the Ediacaran period, you had the mat ground. Imagine a firm seafloor sealed tight by these tough mats of microbes. Oxygen couldn't really get in. Then the burrowers arrived. They were like little ecosystem engineers, tearing up those mats, churning everything up into a soft, soupy mixed ground that was now rich with oxygen. It was a total disaster for the old mat-dwelling creatures. But for the new Cambrian animals, it was paradise. Okay, let's talk about the superstar of the Cambrian, Anomalocaris. You know the classic image, this terrifying apex predator crushing trilobites with its fearsome claws. But what if I told you recent science says that's completely wrong? What was it really hunting, and how did it do it? Get this, it turns out those scary-looking appendages were actually kind of delicate. They probably would have shattered if they tried to crush a hard trilobite shell. So we've had to completely rethink this creature. Forget the slow, tank-like crusher. Instead, picture Anomalocaris as a sleek, high-speed hunter, using its enormous, complex eyes to chase down soft-bodied prey in the open water. A totally different kind of predator. All right, this next one is about us. Well, our deepest, weirdest ancestors anyway. For a long time, we thought Pikaia was our earliest relative from this time, but we found fossils that are even older. So, what are the names of the two creatures now crowned our oldest known vertebrate ancestors? The answer is Hycoichis and Milocumingia. And the secret to their success, and the success of every vertebrate that followed, including you, was something called neural crest cells. Think of these as a master biological toolkit. They allowed for the development of complex heads, powerful eyes, and all sorts of new senses. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a whole new operating system for life. Round 3, and we're staying in China for this one. Back in 2019, a discovery called the Qingjiang biota sent absolute shockwaves through the world of paleontology. This fossil bed was found right near the famous Qingjiang site. So what made it so unbelievably special? So there are two huge reasons this was such a big deal. First, an incredible 92% of the species found there were totally new to science. They weren't found at the other site at all. This proved that even 500 million years ago, different marine environments had their own totally unique communities. Second, the preservation was just unreal. It captured so many soft-bodied animals, like jellyfish, that almost never fossilize. It's like finding a lost library. Okay, time to play geological detective. The islands of Japan didn't exist in the Cambrian, but we do find rocks from that time there. A very specific type of trilobite fossil found in those rocks connects them to an ancient supercontinent. So what's the trilobite, and where on the ancient map was Japan? The trilobite is Redlitia, and finding this little guy in Japanese rocks is the smoking gun. It's powerful evidence that the chunks of crust that would eventually become Japan were once nestled right up against the giant southern supercontinent of Gondwana, probably right near modern-day Australia. How cool is that? All right, time to bust a myth. You've probably seen this online, right? A picture of what looks exactly like a metal screw or bolt, supposedly found in rock that's hundreds of millions of years old. So what is this thing really? And why do our brains get so easily tricked into seeing something man-made? The big reveal? It's not a screw. It's just the fossilized stem of an ancient marine animal called a crinoid, or sea lily. Its stem was made of these little disc-like segments stacked on top of each other, which look exactly like screw threads when they fossilize. The reason our brain screams screw is a classic case of pareidolia. It's the exact same phenomenon that makes us see a face on Mars or a man in the moon. Okay, on to round 4. And for this one, we're leaving the ocean behind. Most people picture Cambrian land as a totally barren, empty wasteland. But that's not the whole story. We actually have fossil evidence of the very first animal footsteps on land. What is the name of those tracks? Those first footsteps are named protogenites. And you can just picture it, can't you? They were likely made by large arthropods, think something like an ancient scorpion or giant sea bug, scuttling out of the water onto the tidal flats. Now, they weren't moving in permanently. This was just a brief trip, probably to scavenge for food or to lay their eggs away from all the predators in the sea. Here we are, the final round. The last question. All good things must come to an end, and the Cambrian period was no exception. It didn't fade away quietly, though. It closed with a series of devastating mass extinctions. What was the name of the major geochemical event that triggered this global crisis? The answer is the SPICE event. That's an acronym for a massive global disruption in the Earth's carbon cycle. And the consequence was absolutely devastating. Widespread ocean anoxia. In simple terms, huge parts of the ocean lost their oxygen. The oceans couldn't breathe. This suffocating water then washed up onto the shallow shelves, where most of the Cambrian life was thriving, wiping them out. And that's it. 10 rounds are in the books. So how'd you do? Are you officially a Cambrian master? You know, whether you got 10 out of 10 or 1 out of 10, the big takeaway is this. The fundamental animal body plans, the predator-prey arms races, the very foundations of the world we know today, they were all forged in the Cambrian. In a very real sense, we are all living in the echoes of that ancient explosion.